afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series today. This webinar's in partnership with Generali Real Estate. My name is Charlotte Neal, and I'm Director of Surveying Practice at the RICS. Today, I'm delighted that we're here to talk about whole life costs and CapEx in real estate. I'm joined by a fantastic panel who I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear from. We have Jeff Blaylock, who's Head of UK Delivery at Deepki. Jeff, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about yourself.
Yep, great. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Jeff Blaylock, and I'm the Head of UK Delivery here at Deepki. Deepki is a SaaS and consultancy, and we work with real estate investors on their ESG strategies, especially looking at their whole life cycle carbon and cost plans.
Great,
over to
thank you. We're also here with Cader, who's whole life costing lead and project manager of Gleeds.
Thanks, Charlotte. Cader, I lead the whole life cost delivery service within Gleeds globally. Gleeds is a cost consultancy with a global presence, and I've been doing life cycle models probably for the last 2 decades.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Paolo Micucci, who's Head of Engineering and Project Management at Generali Real Estate. Welcome.
Hi to everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm the responsible project management function, say within the Generali Real Estate company. I'm also the CEO of the development company in City Life since the end of 2021, which is a 100% owned company owned by Generali, and responsible for the regeneration of 380,000 square meters in Milan. Previously, I worked 6 years in another development company called Pirelli Real Estate, and I spent 11 years in engineering for OVA Group.
Fantastic. So we've got a huge amount of participants signed in to listen today from over 50 countries worldwide. So welcome, whether it's morning, noon or evening to you all. Please do submit questions to our panel. We're really hoping to be able to answer all your questions and clear up some nuances that you may have. You can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen, and we'll pick up as many as we can as we go through the session. So we're constantly under pressure to reduce costs and build the best assets whilst protecting their investment value. So Ritz, what is whole life cost and why are we undertaking the modelling?
Okay. So whole life cost is a concept of where we look at an asset. An asset can be a building, it can be a road, it can be an airport or a railway station, or even a train itself. And we look at the cost of buying that asset or building it, and then operating it for 30, 40, 50 years. There are multiple definitions of whole life costs, and in some countries they're called total cost of ownership. And the RICS has a definition which we generally tend to use, which says that whole life cost includes non-construction costs, and that's the cost of, saying, buying the land that you want to build a building on, the life cycle cost, which includes the cost of construction, changing or renewing the assets, the operating cost, which is utility, gas, water, waste, maintenance costs, which is your day-to-day maintenance, annual servicing, and then finally your end of life, which looks at if you demolish the building, how much that's going to cost you. And then the third aspect of the whole life cost is the income. So if you have a building and you rent it out, that generates an income which offsets your initial CapEx cost, or if you are an investor, that is your return on investment. And then your final one is externalities, which is things like insurance, tax, In the UK, we have something called Section 106, which is government or local authority legislation, which asks you to do certain things which are typically outside your project. So we have to include for that. So the advantage of a whole life cost, it gives you a full picture of an asset over a long-term period, rather than just the cost of building it or buying it in the first place. If you go to the next slide, please. And typically, we create whole life costs for various reasons. In the UK and in other countries, there are local and central and local government requirements that a whole life cost model is created. So, for example, in the UK, in some departments, for any projects over £5 million, before you can get any kind of approval, you need to show what the capital cost is, as well as what the whole life cost is of the building. We also do it as part of sustainability accreditations, such as BREEAM, both UK and international, STDAMA, which is a Middle East system, and Envision, which is an infrastructure-based accreditation for that. On countries which have PFI and PPP, that's always a contractual requirement in terms of life cycle costing, as well as business case approval, whether it's central, local government, NGOs, or even commercial enterprises now are looking for business cases, especially where we have to consider multiple options. So, typically, you might have a building and you'll say, well, do I refurbish it or do I demolish and rebuild it? And you might have a business case which looks at different options. And consequently, we calculate the whole life cost of each option. Owners and occupiers, this is something that's increasingly from our side, we're seeing as consultants. Somebody buys a piece of building or land, they want to know how much it's going to cost them to run it. What they don't want to do is to build it and then not have enough money to maintain the building. Investors and developers, again, that influences the rent you can charge for it, the amount of time an investor will hold that building for, depending on how long, what their strategy is. Residential block charges, so they're called service charges or condominium fees, homeowners associations in some countries, reserve studies, depending on which sector or part of the world you are in. And that is typically for shared responsibility. So on an apartment block, there will be the cost of maintaining the lifts, for cleaning all the commercial central areas, and also landscaping, etc. So that's that. And then finally, which I tend to do a lot of, is lender and funder approval. So as a bank, we lend some money to you. We want to know that you are going to maintain your building so that the value of the asset for the building is maintained. We don't want to lend you £300 million and then 10 years down the line the building's worth 200. So those are the 8 main categories of where whole life costs are created. We do also get some other unusual ones, but these are the main 8 ones. Thanks.
Really helpful. Thank you for talking us through that. Paolo, are we seeing a transition towards whole life costs over CapEx in real estate with your client hat on?
Well, absolutely. I mean, from my personal experience, I would say the transition is, already well underway. At least, with all the companies that manage the whole design life of the project, acting perhaps as a developer first and portfolio manager afterwards, but with a long-term view. Let's take, for example, Generali. We are an insurance company, probably the 3rd, the 4th in the world. Sorry, not in the world, in Europe. We invest, say, 5-6% of the overall asset under management in the real estate. This leads to a portfolio of, say, 37 billion. In assets located in the main European capital cities. But the most important thing is that we are long-term investors, and therefore we got a long-term view. That's why we have adopted this save whole life cost strategy in our project. Perhaps we spent, a bit more at the beginning, but we get some saving afterwards, and our tenants are quite a lot satisfied, because most of the saving is a benefit that they take themselves. Say that we spend more or less 600-700 million every year on CapEx for valorization project. In all our VPs, we got a lifespan of, say, 15-20 years. So we include, for sure, maintenance, operation cost. We do not include disposal, since in 20 years we will renovate the building again. The relation, say, between initial construction cost versus maintenance and operational service is therefore something that we really manage quite often. So another important point, another important topic is that in the last few years we have to deal with the energy transition, and this has become a mandatory thing to cover, with dealing with all the consumption issues and all the decarbonization topics. Thank you.
No, thank you. What are you seeing in your area in relation to this?
When you say my area in the project management, you mean?
Sorry, I was meaning to Jeff. Are you seeing similar sort of things as Paolo in the way you're considering this?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And it's actually an extension of what Paolo just highlighted at the end there. I mean, ultimately, when you're looking at whole life costs, now you are starting to consider more of that climate risk component to that decision-making process. And that's where we see a lot of our conversation and helping our client base through that kind of decision-making process. So, previously you saw on the slides, there was a kind of a dotted area where you said the environmental costs, right? And how you consider that with our clients who are maybe more of those long-term holders of assets. Those are decisions that need to be considered upfront. Otherwise, it's potentially going to impact the value of that asset at the beginning. And especially when you're looking at a kind of portfolio level process, it could change how you allocate that capital across your kind of business. So certainly seeing a lot of movement there, and we spend a lot of time working with our clients in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I know from my own experience of cost planning, I was asked to look at a project that had massively overrun. And one of the problems was they hadn't done the cost planning, including the sustainability, right at the outset. And so they put in some P&M to make the building more sustainable, but they put it in an area which meant millions of pounds of rent was wiped off the asset. And therefore the capital value is significantly impacted detrimentally. So do you have any examples where you have seen whole life costing leading to long-term cost savings and improved sustainability and ESG outcomes? Jeff, I guess that goes to you initially.
So we certainly, work with our clients at a portfolio level. So ultimately, the key thing that we work with them on is making sure that they understand their kind of climate risk profile, either at an asset, a fund, or a platform or portfolio level, and then be able to look at that profile, that decision-making process, look at the potential stranding of their different assets so that they can really break down and move towards the assets that are at risk of stranding sooner, and then be able to tackle those more aggressively or front load some of that CapEx so that it does not become a risk to their strategy overall. And so we kind of see that implementation approach happen quite regularly, with success of being able to move the conversation forward for them as a business.
And Riz, how do you see that impacting, taking into account the ESG sustainability side of things within the whole life costing models that you're doing?
So a typical example for that would be a naturally ventilated building versus a mechanically ventilated building. It takes a lot more effort to design a naturally ventilated building, and typically the cost would be higher, especially on a larger scale. So what that does is it increases your capital cost, your CapEx cost. However, your operations cost will decrease because you don't have all those mechanical equipments and fan coil units, etc., that are working more or less 18 hours a day. And consequently, your energy consumption decreases and your carbon consumption decreases. So by investing in mechanically ventilated building, your cost goes up, you get a better outcome long-term over the next 30 to 50 years, but also you get a lower carbon output from a sustainability perspective. That's one typical example where the argument of CapEx versus whole life cost comes in. The other examples we can go to, but that's a good example, I would say.
Yeah, fantastic. And Paolo, I'm assuming that you have a lot of pressure under you to make sure that the buildings that you're investing in and ensuring have the appropriate sustainability criteria to keep them future-proofed. So how does this work for you in terms of things that you're seeing?
Well, as I said before, being a long-term investor is having considering the whole life strategy, the whole life cost strategy is a must. And in all our projects, something that we do. So perhaps, an example that I could bring is just one of the latest and perhaps the most important that we're dealing with now. As I said at the beginning, also the CEO of the City Life development, perhaps I would take as an example is the project of City Wave, which is, the last office building that we are now constructing within the compound of City Life here in Milan. And it consists of, say, 2 donut-shaped building blocks with an internal courtyard, and they are both covered by a unique single span canopy roof, which is long, more or less around 20 meters. It's say 60,000 meter square office building designed by PRK Ingalls, and is taking all the latest standards resulting from the energy transition one side and the new way of living in the office in that we are now experiencing in the latest days. We are quite a lot of people are using the smart working or the remote working, so we spend more time at home and less time in the office, but when we are in the office we want to have a bit more qualitative time, so we need to have spaces that are very flexible, comfortable, collaborative. And this building is actually designed with these new requirements. But perhaps another important topic that is also related to sustainability, and something that we will talk later on, but I would like just to mention is the fact that all our building, and this one as well, is in line with the EU taxonomy, and therefore is has got a very low consumption rate. So this is quite common for us, as being EU taxonomy compliant for a building is something that is mandatory to issue a green bond, which is another instrument, financial instruments that we use as an insurance to obtain extra income. It is also a carbon-ready building, and with perhaps a specific thing that can produce green energy through a photovoltaic plant is, if I'm not mistaken, sort of a 1.4 meg photovoltaic plant, all positioned on this massive roof. So on this building we have also the opportunity to produce in situ green energy. All this obviously have incremented the upfront cost, but with our calculation we expect that all the, say, operation costs plus maintenance and so on, all this will be reduced by these features that we have introduced at the beginning.
Thank you. And we've had a question come in. You were talking about the upfront costs there, but end of life costs, are you starting to see material reuse value being implemented or at least considered in whole life cost modeling? I'm guessing that would go to you, Riz. Not wanting to put you on the spot.
So generally we calculate the cost of, say, demolishing a building, hence what the end of life cost is. I suppose the benefit of that, when we reuse all those materials, will go into the next project that is where those materials are being reused. Or in some cases, what we'll do is we'll demolish a building and then use the rubble as a piling mat for the next building. So in that way, not only do we save costs in terms of not having to take materials to landfill or to buy new, fill up material, but we also save the carbon in it because we're reducing our embodied carbon. So yes, we do take into account. It's just depending on whether we use those materials on that particular site, or do we use it for the next project. So depending on who our client is, we can calculate in different ways.
So I think an important factor is how organizations can balance the potentially higher upfront costs of the whole life cycle cost versus achieving a lower CapEx throughout the life cycle. Are whole life cost projects typically more expensive at the outset, or is that more of a myth? Paolo, what have you seen in your experience as an investor there?
Well, certainly, is you need to consider some additional in upfront cost. Not massive, but if you have to do, say, your own place, you will be prepared to spend a bit more if afterwards you consider that you can get some savings. Having said that, you need to be clever and understand how you can take the maximum benefit out from this, say, upfront cost. And perhaps something that we can consider in the building industry is the fact that the tenants nowadays, I mean, when they look at a property to rent, they don't only say now look at the rents value, but they consider, the rents and the operation cost as an unicum. So I would say that reducing operational costs, it makes you to be able to increment slightly the rents, and by, say, increasing the rent value, you got even the value of your building, I mean, is increasing. So by doing this, you get a compensation of this additional cost that you get at the beginning. So that is what we generally consider, and that is why we are prepared generally, I'm not saying for the project, to spend a bit more at the beginning, because at the end you got, a product that has got a higher value.
And how are you seeing that play out, Riz, when you're doing the modelling and producing these life cycle costings?
So I think I'd agree with what Paolo said. There is definitely, not only in the commercial sector, but also in the public sector as well. There is definitely an appetite for spending to save later on. So, for example, you might spend £100,000 or dollars, whichever currency you look at, on photovoltaic panels, which is a CapEx cost. But we know that those photovoltaics will work for the next 25, 30 years generating electricity, which then reduces your electricity costs. but also decreases your carbon as well, because we know electricity in some countries is very carbon intensive, in other countries it's not. So in countries where electricity is very carbon intensive, by doing that, yes, you spend £100,000 upfront, but you save £10,000 for the next 25 years. So, so in some cases, the calculation is very simple. In other cases, it's not so simple. It's not so straightforward, especially when we are looking at things like, new technologies, which is not always proven. So, for example, in Northern Europe and perhaps, Northern Hemisphere, air source heat pumps was always something that was where a lot of people had nervousness about it. But now we have probably 10 years worth of information to say actually an air source heat pump is beneficial. It's better than gas-fired heating systems or hot water systems. So sometimes the challenges that we have is not about the cost side of things, but to convince people that the technology works. And that's where we need the investors and the client organizations to take the initiative to put these new things in, which we know will save them money in the long run.
Maybe just a point there, building on Riz, what you're saying. One of the things that we've been seeing and talking to our kind of client base is an increase of purchasing these kind of poor energy performing buildings with the goal of retrofitting them and adding value and being more kind of proactive and being able to identify where those opportunities lie based off of initial due diligence and things like that. We see a lot of more movement and activity in that space. Perhaps it's a bit of a question to Riz and Paolo as well, if that's something that you're seeing on your sides.
We are definitely seeing, as a consultant, we're definitely seeing a lot more retrofit than new build. I don't know whether that's driven by the financial markets, or is it driven by availability, especially, for example, in the UK, availability of land to build new buildings. But we're definitely seeing a huge increase in retrofitting buildings. Part of it is driven by the carbon targets, because the most carbon efficient building is an existing building. So best thing to do is to refurbish an existing one. So that's also driving the need for refurbishing. One thing we're also seeing is, I just am in the Middle East. 10 years ago, if a years old, they were not going to rebuild it. We're now starting to see a change in that, where there's a refurb, because we're realizing there's, why demolish a structure that's very good and standing, because you don't like the look of it. So we're seeing a lot of remodeling, not just Northern Europe, but even other parts of the world.
If I can answer you, Jeff, your questions, well, certainly we are not searching, say, for new project, for new retrofit project. We still have got, a big portfolio to deal with. So we've got enough with our portfolio. And we are working closely with your colleagues, actually, in trying to say, well, no, we have already started to do a big map of our portfolio, so we know where we are. And we've got a plan, we've got a new, not 3 years plan, but we have a new 10 years plan, where basically we have mapped all the interventions that are required in order to do, say, the proper retrofit, in order to have all our portfolio to be, say, compliant with the EU taxonomy first, and with the decarbonization, which is the other important pillar for us.
Nice, yeah, I know that's something that we kind of see quite regularly, is this kind of change of maturity in how our clients are looking at kind of whole life cycle cost, as well as whole life cycle carbon, and being able to take that knowledge from their carbon risk perspective and translate that into their kind of cost plan, and being able to proactively put CapEx expenses at certain periods of time for maybe outlier assets to make sure that they're not left with a stranding or a potential asset that's going to be at risk in the future based off of regulation changes or emission risks.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, isn't it? The retrofit, it's so important at the moment, and we have all these challenges about what to do with buildings that may be becoming obsolete. How best can organizations formulate a whole life cost strategy given the multiple stages of a building's life and the diverse stakeholders involved in the property life cycle? You've got your developers who then sell on to investors, etc., etc. How do we capture all this in the whole life cost strategy? Riz, I don't know if you can start with that, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think at an organizational level, it is an organizational change where, as an organization, you realize that actually spending a little bit more upfront will save you more later on. And if I look at from an investor's perspective, you spend more, you'll probably get higher rent for it because you can convince your future tenants that the operation cost is much lower. The challenges with multiple stakeholders is more trickier when you come to central or local authorities because different people will have different priorities. So in those cases, it's then trying to convince each stakeholder and giving them their perspective of why a whole life cost is more beneficial. So, if you look at it from a finance director perspective, you could say, well, by spending this, yes, your initial CapEx is more. However, if you NPV the expenditure on the building over the next 25 years or 30, 40, 50 years, even with intermediate refurbishment, your NPV is still lower. So your internal rate of return from a finance director's perspective is better. If you look at from an environmentalist perspective, you can say yes, your carbon output for the building is better because you're not replacing the carpet so often or the flooring so often. Generally, a building with a better whole life cost, the maintenance cost will also be lower. So from a maintenance perspective, if you speak to maintenance people, then you can say, well, you need to do less of this building. So a naturally ventilated building will have probably 20% less maintenance requirements than a mechanically ventilated building. So we do have the individual stakeholders that we have as a challenge from. But the other challenge we also have is to get the design team and the specification team. So as the client, when you specify what you want, rather than just saying, oh, I want a 50,000 square foot building, it's a 50,000 square foot building, but also does X, Y, and Z. And one of those could be, minimize whole life cost over 50 years or whatever your study period is. But we have to start at the beginning of the project, whether it's a retrofit or new build. Looking at whole life cost at REBA stage 4 or detailed design is not the right time for it.
Yeah, quite. And obviously a key stakeholder in the whole value chain is the tenant. And we were just talking about sustainability, etc. within that, and tenants as a whole. You mentioned, the cost of carpets, etc., etc. And maybe this is one for Jeff. Are the tenants actually willing to pay more in their rent to get the sustainability measures that are implemented within the whole life costs? Or is this a real challenge for those stakeholders, such as Paolo, who's the investor at the end, but needs that rent roll to protect their asset value?
I think ultimately you're seeing kind of macro changes or shifts within this space where there are a lot of the kind of key tenants are changing their demands. At least this is what we're hearing from clients, and they are looking to tap into that as an opportunity, depending on what asset class they're in as part of their investment profile. So we certainly see a lot more conversations around being able to take those, if you're in the office space, trying to move that kind of maybe risk assets into maybe Class A office space where you can tap into those higher rents, and seeing that as an investment approach. I mean, the key thing that we tried to do in this kind of taps into your point is being able to understand where you're at in terms of the climate risk or the carbon part of the conversation. We spend a lot of time there. The key part is being able to leverage clear or be comfortable with the underlying data, so that you can then move into that decision-making process and CapEx expense plan quite comfortably and confidently, based off of different benchmarks or clear transparency around where you're at based off of the rest of your portfolio. So, there's a number of different elements here that need to come together to be able to kind of proactively move forward to tap into those the potential of the demands, the changing demands of tenants.
And Paolo, are you seeing that go through within the rents that you're receiving on your assets?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of considerations on this, Charlotte. I mean, on one hand, as I said, I mean, initially, considering that you provide a building that is reducing, say, the operating cost, you put the tenant, I mean, you let the tenant to be more prepared to pay something more on the rent side. If afterwards they do any investment themselves in order, say, to be, to go into the sustainability, into the sustainable direction, not sure. I mean, it really depends on the tenants. Certainly, the thing that we do is that because we want to have our building to be sustainable from, how do you say, a 360 perspective, we do our best on our side, but also we ask the tenant to do the best on their side. So that's what we do. We create sort of a green lease, where basically we give rules in how to use the building. And in that regards, even in I don't know, I mean, I don't want to offend anyone, but I mean, there are different, say, American companies that, I mean, they use massively all the, say, technology, to reduce the temperature in the building. And, I mean, that is consuming an enormous amount of energy. So there are the kind of rules that we put also, say, in our, say, lease agreements. And also, I know that, I mean, we all should be going for the, say, green energy to be produced on site, but in these days, the only thing that we are able to do is to buy green energy from the market, with a certificate of origin and so on and so on. And we ask the tenant to do the same. So if that costs a bit more, I mean, that is something they need to be prepared to do. So yeah, we want to, say, have the tenant fully on board on these aspects, and we see that in the past. I mean, we started actually quite a while ago. I mean, we started 10 years ago, but 10 years ago it was very difficult. Now, I mean, people are more open to this, and you could say that, I mean, at the end, you can produce a nice match between the two, and the results are coming.
So we have this challenge with working out where we're best to spend our money and the investment. What are the challenges that we face in accurately predicting the whole life costs, and how do we overcome those, especially when we have external factors that obviously play significantly into these things? Riz, you must have come across this in the last couple of years. Perhaps you can help give some insight onto how you adapt your costings for those unknowns.
Okay, so when we look at a whole life cost, there, the multiple elements of it. So the cost side, the base cost of building the building is relatively straightforward, because we will have cost managers or quantity surveyors who will produce those. Where we get challenges is then getting the rest of the costs. So, for example, how much energy does a school use every year? Or how much does a private company spend on maintenance in their flagship building? Not everybody is willing to share that data. That's the first thing. Second thing, even if they're willing to share it, it doesn't have the right quality or the right level of granularity that would make that data useful. Or the other one that we also have is we have external factors that sometimes challenge certain things. COVID, for example, changed the way we did a lot of things. Political situations and globally, that affects things. Oil prices makes a big difference. The Suez Canal, when the ship got stuck there, nobody anticipated that. But suddenly, you had a global shift in supply of certain types of goods. So those things are things we can't predict. However, thankfully, most of the things that there are on a 3 to 5 year timeline. They will generally tend to come back to normalize to their level. So if you look at something over a 40, 50 year, we can generalize, we can normalize all those peaks and troughs that you could do. But I think the challenge for us is getting good quality data from reliable sources that we can use. I think, Jeff, you'll probably have the same challenges in that, there's some things we can use. So if there's a particular project that I'm working on and I follow that project through for the next 3 or 5 years, I can anonymize that data and reuse it. But that's only limited to the projects that I work on. So that's the challenge that we always have. And that's where, the RICS and all the global organizations can assist us, because, you can effectively be the gatekeeper of that information, which then all third parties can use.
I think Jeff mentioned data in his previous answer, and you've obviously just mentioned data. And aside from the RICS now need to provide the answer for all, Jeff, how do we get better availability of data and accurate data for measuring and reporting these costs, particularly in terms of tracking building costs to operate and maintain our assets?
Yeah, for sure. So I think obviously this has been a pain point for the industry, I think, for a while. I'm sure many of us have been kind of impacted by that over the years, and trying to manage a whole bunch of different invoices, data streams, if you're at all attached to trying to determine the energy efficiency of your buildings. Ultimately, I think those tools there are new tools that we can really tap into, and that's what we're trying to kind of change that discussion, automating that data flow, being able to kind of do that en masse across hundreds of buildings at once, leveraging different tools across Europe and globally, and that's something that we work quite extensively to try and unlock. So as an example, we have kind of over 1,300 different connectors with suppliers and DSOs and such to kind of pull in those automatic data feeds, so this does not become a data point, and you can kind of move past that and start getting to those that kind of transparency around understanding the kind of costs associated with that. I mean, it's a huge thing that has been discussed over many years, and I think we're ultimately at a stage where we can start to move past it and leverage the tools that we have. Paolo, I know you mentioned that you've kind of done some of this work, I think, with us in the past, but be keen to know your thoughts. But certainly something that we're seeing across our client base, so they can get into the action stage of the conversation rather than get stuck at the data stage.
Jeff, I mean, you're perfectly right. And you know, I mean, with your colleagues, I mean, we started, you know, with all these, say, billion analysis and getting all this data. We started to have the first information on the buildings, and that's why, I mean, that's how we got, I mean, the first full picture. And I think we were one of the first, you know, with the portfolio, with this size portfolio, to have a full picture of the portfolio. And I mean, thanks to this tool, I mean, we managed, I mean, to get this picture in quite short time. What we are now, say, experiencing, Jeff, is that to have a bit more, say, accurate data at the end. I mean, the only way is to put measurements on the buildings, and that is, you know, the second stage. But you know, putting measurements in the buildings, I mean, costs money. And also you need to go into an area where, I mean, at the moment it's occupied by your tenant, so you don't have the full freedom, I mean, to operate. So it is a tricky thing, and therefore, yeah, sometimes you work on assumptions, sometimes you work on, you know, real data coming from measurements. But I think that in the future, I mean, all the buildings need to be provided with all these measurements. And you know, we are also going in the direction of having intelligent building. Having intelligent building means having the possibility to gather all the data around your building, having a sort of, say, brain somewhere, which is you know, the computer unit that afterwards, I mean, can elaborate all the data and can maneuver within the building. So, but it's a very interesting topic, and I mean, it's very hot, I mean, these days. And thank you.
We're seeing this move. What role do you think that the government and professional bodies have in encouraging wider adoption of whole life cost approach? I mean, I know that obviously the RICS has the life cycle cost document amongst other information that we produce, but are we seeing regulatory frameworks leading to a significant increase in whole life cost approach? Riz, you mentioned in your earlier introduction about the government. What do you think on this?
Definitely, from our consultant's perspective, so central government regulation has definitely pushed that up, and I'll probably say, at least from Gleeds' perspective, probably 70% of our work is from is due to legislation, either because of business cases or because of sustainability accreditation, and then the rest of the work is generally from, like, you know, like Generali, who as an investor is saying, well, I want to have a building that costs lower so that my I can get a higher rent, which is, you know, that's what they want to maximize from their perspective. So we are seeing it from both sides, and there is a genuine interest in understanding whole life costs, if I can say that, without upsetting them. Some people, 10, 15 years ago, a whole life cost sometimes was done as a tick box exercise, and that's now changing. We are genuinely seeing a genuine interest in trying to understand it. We're having clients come back to us and say, well, why have you assumed this and not that? So, you know, which is good from, as a personal, you know, who delivers the service. That's really good to see that.
And Paolo, oh, sorry, go ahead.
The last thing I would say is, you know, organizations such as the RICS and the ISO publishing documents also helps as well, because that tells people, professionals, on how to do this and how to deliver a whole life cost model or a life cycle cost model.
Paolo, how much are you seeing as an investor the need to push for whole life cycle costings to influence this right from the start?
Well, certainly, you know, we are a great fan of wildlife costs. I mean, for all the reasons that I explained before. So yeah, perhaps, I mean, company like us, you know, big investment company can have, you know, a role on this in pushing the market to go in this direction. But as I said, I mean, I think that where we find difficulties is mainly when you have to do with, say, opportunistic developers. That obviously what they do is that, you know, they are IRR driven. So what happened afterwards is not really, I mean, it's not their main interest. I mean, honestly, I don't have an answer. I mean, certainly the thing that we can say is that, I mean, company like us, so a company that you know, manage a portfolio, something that they have already do, and they are already pushing, say, within the market, in order to get a service that can cover this. Because I mean, the other thing that we might say is that perhaps in UK is different, but I see that in the continental Europe, you know, this this approach to cover the whole picture, say, for all the design life of a building, is not something that you see very much. So there is not much service, not much specialism on this. I think that our duty is, say, to push more within the market and to get, I mean, higher consultancy on this, and perhaps, I mean, to influence all the others. That's the only thing I can say.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And Riz, are you seeing that it's mostly in the UK that you're being asked for this, or are you seeing it in other parts of the globe?
No, we're definitely seeing an increase globally. It's no longer just a UK thing. At least over the last 20 years, you know, maybe the first 5 years was definitely UK, which was primarily driven by the PFI PPP market 20 years ago. But now we are definitely seeing an interest globally. Not just, you know, it's not just, you know, even Europe. It's Europe, Middle East, North America. So with APAC, data centers is because of data centers that is pushing the requirement to consider what they, you know, data center world, they call it total cost of ownership. They're definitely pushing towards that.
Yeah, I think it's something that it makes sense, but joining all the key stakeholders together is a challenge for everyone, isn't it? But hopefully, especially for you, Riz, carrying out these models, I hope that it moves more to that way globally, and for everyday considerations with the assets that we're dealing with. I'd just like to say a big thank you to Jeff, Paolo and Riz for your time this afternoon. It's been a really interesting conversation, and thank you also to Generali Real Estate, who have partnered with us on this webinar. It's really great to be working alongside some of the big players within our industry. Please do look out for our forthcoming webinars, which can be seen on screen now. We've got some great discussions coming up. Please do join us for those that are of interest to you. I'm particularly interested in housing markets in 2024 and beyond. I'll be polishing my crystal ball for that one. If you require any further information regarding what we've said or any of these upcoming webinars, please do search for rics.org/WebEF or search World Built Environment Forum on LinkedIn. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us, and thanks again to our panel. Been very insightful, and I hope going forward it will encourage those of you who've not yet adopted whole life costing within your modelling to embrace that approach, especially as we've got to consider so much more these days with sustainability, etc. So it's really great behalf of the panelists, and thanks very much for joining us today.